Ladies and gentlemen, my name is L.J. Stambuk, and I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. I would like to welcome you here today on this beautiful Charlotte day. And what a great crowd we have here today. We have with us Dr. Graham Allison, a great friend of Charlotte Davidson and the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. I don't know if you know this, but he received the highest honor that we give, which is the World Citizen Award. And Graham Allison got this reward in 2009. We're delighted that he's here with us today. We'll speak more about Dr. Allison in a moment. But please let me use this opportunity to recognize a couple of people and introduce them to you. We have with us the Honorary Consul of Mexico to the Carolinas, the Honorary Wayne Cooper. Hold your applause. And we also have with us the Honorary Consul of Italy to North Carolina, the Honorary Claudio Carpano. So a big round of applause to our Honorary Consuls. Thank you. I would like to thank our sponsor, Davidson College. Great friend. Thank you, Davidson College. We also have with us schools in attendance. We have the Queen's University. Thank you, Queen's University. And we always mention UNC Charlotte, our host. This is where the World Affairs Council has its base and its offices. Thank you, UNC Charlotte, for what you're doing for us. And Dr. Joel Galagos is here with us as well.
Good afternoon. I'm Linwood Mallard, a board member of the World Affairs Council. Delighted to have the privilege today to introduce our speaker, who I have known since we were in the first grade together at Eastover Elementary. As director of Harvard's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, Graham Allison is a leading analyst of U.S. national security and defense policy, with a special interest in nuclear weapons, terrorism, and decision-making. As Assistant Secretary of Defense in the first Clinton administration, Dr. Allison received the Defense Department's highest civilian award, the Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service, for reshaping relations with Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan to reduce the former Soviet nuclear arsenal. This resulted in the safe return of more than 12,000 tactical nuclear weapons from former Soviet republics and the complete elimination of more than 4,000 strategic nuclear warheads previously targeted at the United States. His 2013 book, Lee Kuan Yew, The Grandmaster's Insights on China, the U.S., and the World, has been a bestseller in the U.S. and abroad. A previous book, Nuclear Terrorism, The Ultimate Preventable Catastrophe, is now in its third printing and was selected by the New York Times as one of the 100 most notable books of 2004. His first book, Essence of Decision, Explaining the Cuban Missile Crisis, which he wrote in 1971, ranks among the all-time bestsellers with more than 450,000 copies in print. The book he will discuss today, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape Thucydides Trap, was published just a couple of weeks ago in May. As founding dean of the modern Kennedy School, under his leadership from 1977 to 1989, this then small, undefined program grew 20-fold to become a major professional school of public policy and government. Dr. Allison served as special advisor to the Secretary of Defense under President Reagan and as a member of the Defense Policy Board for Defense Secretaries Weinberger, Carlucci, Cheney, Aspen, Perry, and Cohen. He currently serves on the advisory board of the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and the Director of the CIA. Dr. Allison was the organizer of the Commission on America's National Interest in 1996 and 2000, a founding member of the Trilateral Commission, a director on the Council for Foreign Relations, and has been a member of numerous public committees and commissions addressing non-proliferation and prevention of weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. He has served as a director on prominent U.S. companies too numerous to recite and advisory boards of Chase Bank, Chemical Bank, Hydro-Quebec, and the International Energy Corporation. Graham Allison was born and raised in Charlotte. He was educated at Davidson College, Harvard College, magna cum in history, Oxford University as a Marshall Scholar, first-class honors in philosophy, politics, and economics, back at Harvard, Ph.D. in political science. One last unofficial comment I will take the liberty, as Graham's lifelong friend, to add a bit of color to your picture of this renowned scholar, educator, statesman, and author. He was a bruising fullback and ferocious linebacker on the Myers Park 56-57 teams, which went undefeated in 18 consecutive games. And he entered Davidson on a football scholarship. Before handing the microphone to Dr. Allison, allow me to recognize family members present today. I thought first that his incredibly talented wife of 50 years, Dr. Elizabeth Allison, another Harvard PhD, would be here, but her plane didn't get in time. But his brother, Jim Allison, is over here. Jim is with the prominent Charlotte law firm of Johnston, Allison, and Horde. The World Affairs Council is proud that Dr. Allison has been our featured speaker on 3 occasions in the past and our World Citizens Award winner in 2009, LJ said. Please join me in giving Graham Allison a rousing welcome to his hometown.
So thank you very much, Linwood. And what Linwood didn't say is that a good portion of that football team at Myers Park is here. Linwood was the halfback. Ray Ferris was the quarterback. Clayton Bundy was the end. So I'm not sure. I may be missing. Duncan Morton was another end. And I'm sure I'm missing somebody else. So my father would occasionally say, I would say, I grew up in Charlotte. And he would say, no, that's not correct. You just lived your first 18 years here. So in any case, I was happy to be a student at Eastover and at Myers Park High School and at Davidson College. I have a lot of great friends here. My brother and his wife live here. My mother and father live their lives here. When people ask me, where am I from, I say I'm from Charlotte, and I'm very proud to be from Charlotte. So it's a pleasure for me to be back here. So I'm going to talk to you today about a fairly serious subject, but the bottom line of the subject is not as ominous as the title of the book. Okay? But I published a book that's now was Memorial Day, so I've been in a rather whirlwind rollout of this book over the last 10 days. And the book is entitled Destined for War, Can America and China Escape Thucydides Trap? And I think there are copies outside for people who are interested. I'm seriously committed to the thesis of this book, and I'm doing all I can to try to push the ideas in the book, because I think they're important for all thinking Americans to take account of, including especially people in Charlotte, I hope. Okay? But to start with, because I know that Thucydides is multisyllabic and is also a mouthful, I want to make sure, at least for Charlotteans, we can all say this correctly. Okay? So we're going to do in unison 3 times. Thucydides, Thucydides, Thucydides. Okay. So you can go Google Thucydides if That's not a word that's part of your normal vocabulary. Thucydides ought to be part of the canon, part of your library, part of your mental frame, because he was indeed the founder of history. So he created the discipline that we now think of as history, which is an effort to try to document what actually happened for the purpose of learning what happened in a particular case so that successors don't have to make the same mistakes over. And that's what he says at the beginning of his wonderful history called The History of the Peloponnesian War. So he wrote about the conflict between the two great city-states of classical Greece 2,500 years ago. But the book that he wrote is brilliant, and another thing that I would urge you to do as part of your summer reading is go Google it or go to Amazon. You can download it for free. Okay? Just read the book one, the first 100 pages, which is how Athens and Sparta got into the war. And if it doesn't knock your socks off, you don't have to read any further. Okay? It's a terrific book, absolutely terrific. So I'm going to organize the comments here and take about 20 minutes for three big questions. And then I'll give you a tweet a piece about each of them, and then I'll elaborate just a little further. Okay? So first, what has been the geopolitical event of your and my professional lives over the past generation? That's question one. Question two, what is the geostrategic challenge for today and for as far as any eye can see for the professional lives of the students I teach at Harvard at the Kennedy School? What's the central geostrategic challenge? And then third, the title of the book, or the subtitle, Can America and China Escape Thucydides Trap? So to the first question, what's the geopolitical event of our lifetime? It is, I believe, the rise of China from nowhere to the top of the league chart in almost every dimension. That's a little longer than a tweet, but not much. So what is the geostrategic challenge going forward for as far as any eye can see? And it is the impact of the rise of China on the U.S. and on the international order that the U.S. constructed and has maintained over the past 7 decades, which are the principal reason why we've seen 7 decades without great power war. And thirdly, can America and China escape Thucydides' trap? And the answer is no and yes. Okay? So this is professorial, and I apologize, but that's my business. Okay? No, if we insist on business as usual. So I say in the book, business as usual will likely produce history as usual, even though history as usual in this case will be catastrophic. And yes, we can escape Thucydides' trap, because, as the saying goes, only those who fail to study history are condemned to repeat it. So that's 3 questions, 3 tweets. Let me say another word about each. The rise of China. Some of you I know study China and have paid attention. Most have enough on your plate without thinking about the rise of China. Almost nobody has got it, really appreciates or has got their mind around what's actually happened over this period. I am not a student of China. I don't speak Mandarin, I don't read Mandarin, but I have for the last decade been studying China. And I've had several great tutors. So Henry Kissinger was my professor at Harvard. I was his course assistant. He still thinks I'm his course assistant. So from time to time, he calls up and says, Graham, I need, some more of this or that. And I say, Henry, that's not my topic. He says, that's okay. You can do this. Okay. So he just celebrated his 94th birthday last week. Yeah, last week. And his mind is still lucid. And Lee Kuan Yew, who was the founder and builder of Singapore, about whom Linwood Mitch and I wrote a book, where I spent a lot of time. Lee Kuan Yew was the world's premier China watcher. And he was also a great tutor for me in trying to help me understand something about China. Then we have a China working group. But in any case, I'm not claiming to be a student of China. Indeed, to some extent, if you're not a student of China and so you haven't been paying attention every day, you may be able to get the forest clearer. So most of you know that most Harvard people are essentially self-referential. Okay? So to demonstrate that this is true, let me give you an illustration just of the point. There's a bridge at Harvard that actually the Spanglers and I found ourselves walking across recently between the Harvard Business School and the Harvard Kennedy School. The rehabilitation or reconstruction of this bridge was initially discussed when I was dean of the Kennedy School, and I quit being dean in 1988. The construction project began in earnest in 2012, a 2-year construction project. As of today, the completion date is just question mark. Okay? They've given up having a completion target date, and the project is 3 times over budget. So if I were giving you my slideshow, I would show you the Anderson Bridge, and if you just Google it, you can look at the Anderson Bridge and see this project that's still going. And I'm quite familiar with it because this makes a big traffic jam for a long time. There is a bridge in China, in Beijing, called the Sanyan Bridge, which I've ridden across. This bridge is twice as large as the Anderson Bridge, maybe 3 times. And it was reconstructed in 2013. How long did that reconstruction project take? Let's just take a guess. 1 year. Who else? 6 months? 43 hours. You Google it. You can Google it. You go to YouTube and ask for and it's a fantastic, you can see the time stamp on it. 43 hours. And I've ridden across this bridge. If they would come and finish the Anderson Bridge in 43 hours, I would help pay for it. Okay? Okay. So if you want an image of China, never has a country risen so far, so fast, in so many different dimensions. I say in the and I have a good capsule version of this in the chapter called The Rise of China, where I quote Václav Havel, the former president of the Czech Republic. And he says, things have happened so fast, we haven't yet had time to be astonished. You'll see in it a little abbreviated version of a chart I give to students in my class at Harvard, in which the question is, when could China become number 1? And I have 26 indicators. In the book, I only give you the 10 indicator chart. So automobile manufacturer, smartphone manufacturer, robot manufacturer, supercomputer, fastest computer, artificial intelligence, number of billionaires, size of the GDP. And students say, well, maybe 2040, not in my lifetime, this one, maybe this, maybe that. Then I show them chart 2, which you'll see in the book. And the title of it, the heading is Already. So in every one of these 26 dimensions, China, which wasn't in any of these league tables 30 years ago, has now rivaled the U.S. and in many areas surpassed the U.S. Indeed, here's a piece of news you won't read in your newspaper every day. China has today the largest economy in the world, bigger than the economy of the United States. Well, why does the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times continue reporting that the U.S. has the biggest economy? Because if you measure the economy by market exchange rates, the U.S. still has the biggest economy. But if you go to CAA or to the IMF and see what they think is the yardstick for comparing national economies, they think it's a yardstick called purchasing power parity. And the big takeaway, the headline from the IMF World Bank meeting in 2014 was, China has become number 1. the largest economy in the world. So I explore this, again, in only 25 pages to try to capture, as I can, what's happened with the rise of China. But really, we haven't yet seen the half of it. And one should take time to look at it to be astonished. Never any other analog. So that's point one, the big geopolitical event of our lifetime. Point two, what's the geostrategic challenge for the U.S. and for the world going forward? And I believe it's the impact of this meteoric rise on the U.S., on our conception of our role in the world, what we're going to do, and on the international order that the U.S. was the principal architect of. So I illustrate this in the book with a seesaw. So everybody remembers what is a seesaw. And you have the U.S. on sitting on one seat, and China is sitting on the other seat. So in 1980, the U.S. is got our feet solidly on the ground, and China is 10% of the GDP of the U.S., and that's the situation. By 2014, this seesaw has become even, essentially. Today, China is 10% larger than the U.S., and in 2024, will be half again bigger on the current trend lines. So what is the impact of that on the U.S.? Well, excuse me, the big debate in the Obama administration about the so-called pivot to Asia or the pivot to China was whether we should put more weight on our left foot in the Middle East, where we were fighting wars, or on our right foot in Asia, where the future is. And the argument was we need to put less weight on our left foot in order to put more weight on our right foot. But what was not noticed was all the while this seesaw has been operating to the point that our feet have now been lifted off the ground. So it's not really quite relevant whether one's trying to put a little more weight on this foot or that foot. So the impact of China on the U.S. and the international order is to be determined. For a red-blooded American, and I often say red-necked American, since I come from here proudly, I wear my collar so that people don't see most of the time, but I know in my heart that somewhere it is written, and I've been looking for it, actually. Somebody may be able to help me with this. Either in the Bible or in the Constitution, but somewhere authoritative, it says USA means number one. So I know that the USA is number one, has to be number one, should be number one, is number one. And then I look at the facts and I say, I'm sure some way, somehow, something. So for Americans, the idea that there could be another country as big and strong as we are is inconceivable. For me, it's inconceivable. And I still try to get my head around it. And Lee Kuan Yew would say over and over, and I quote him in the book with respect to this, you Americans will simply not be able to deal with this because you can't believe that there could be another country as big and strong as you are. But you're just going to have to get used to it. And I think the question of how this will work out, so is there a concept for helping us understand what's happening in the relationship between the U.S. and China? And I believe there is. And I think the concept is Thucydides Trap. So let me say just a word about that. So every day, if you're watching your smartphone or looking at the television or reading the news, you'll hear lots of noise and lots of news about China. So yesterday, North Korea launched some more missile tests. An event occurs in the South China Sea. Last week, China became the -- trading partner of Germany. There's a piece in the Post or in the Journal yesterday. China will soon be the #1 box office for movies, and therefore they'll be the principal market for which American movies are made. So you go through all of these, and each day there's a lot of noise and a lot of news. But one needs to look through that noise and news to the structure or even the substructure of what's going on. And that substructure is what Thucydides identified, namely a rising power that's threatening to displace a ruling power. Now, this storyline is as literally as old as history itself. That's the storyline in Thucydides' book about the rise of Athens and its impact on Sparta. And he writes famously, quote, "It was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made the war between the two inevitable." So you can think about this not just in relations between nations. I was in Silicon Valley yesterday making a presentation at Andreessen Horowitz. And I said, think of an upstart like Uber or Google or Apple and an incumbent like Microsoft or the taxi industry. So what does the upstart, what does the rising power think? Well, I'm bigger. I'm stronger. My interests deserve more weight. I should have more say. I should have more sway. The current arrangements are confining. They're limiting my natural growth. And what does the ruling power, the incumbents, say? The situation was great until you began challenging it. Actually, it was only the order that I provided you that created the conditions in which you've been able to grow up, to get bigger and stronger. You can even see this in families. I won't quite go there, but if you see two kids, one of them is much shorter than the other one, and all of a sudden there's a growth spurt, and so the shorter one is taller than the... Now watch the dinner table conversation. Who talks more? Okay? Maybe even a discussion about whether the bedrooms need to be reallocated or I need a little more space. So you can see this in human life. You can see this in gorillas, anywhere you have a hierarchical dominant system. And you can certainly see this in relations among nations. In this book, I look at the last 500 years of history. So I've been working on this book for 5 years. Okay? And I give you potted versions of these 16 cases just in a short version, and then there's a website where you can get a longer version. So in the last 500 years, there have been 16 cases in which a rising power threatened to displace a ruling power. In 12 of the cases, the outcome was war. In 4 of the cases, the outcome was not war. So Thucydides' line about inevitable is exaggeration. He means by that hyperbole. It just means likely, very likely. But I would say the bottom line from this is what I said before. Business as usual, as we see in these cases, will likely produce history as usual, as it has often done. So that's a concept that you want to take away and that the book helps explain, that you can use, that then when you're trying to see what's happening in the news and noise with respect to China, it'll help sort it out. You've got a rising China on a path essentially to collision with a ruling U.S., and the question is whether we can and they can find some way to adapt and adjust. But at least there are 4 cases in which that happened successfully. So there's a lot to learn from those. And there's no reason why we need to make the same mistakes that were made in other cases. So finally, can therefore America and China escape Thucydides' trap? And I think the no answer would say, no, we're just going to continue plodding along. And I would say if you looked at the policies and the actions, and some of which I've been part of in the Clinton administration or the Bush administration or the Obama administration, that's business as usual. Basically, the so-called strategy the U.S. has is called engage and hedge, or engage but hedge. It basically allows everything and excludes nothing. So it's an excuse for going with the flow. And I give a discussion of that in the book. But if I look at these 4 cases of success, I find huge clues and lessons that we might draw from. And I think the 2 that are maybe most instructive to think about are the U.S. rise in the beginning of the 20th century to first rival and then surpass Britain, where there was adjustments made. And the Cold War, which I'm an old Cold Warrior. The Cold War was a mind-blowing idea. At the rise of the Soviet Union, which when John Kennedy became president, most Americans, and he certainly believed, the Soviet Union was going to overtake the U.S. in the 70s. If you want to get a a measure of that. I have a discussion of it in the book. Paul Samuelson, the economic textbook that probably most of us read, the 1964 edition, says that by the end of the 70s, the Soviet Union will overtake the U.S. So that was the conventional wisdom of the time. But the strategy that people developed for dealing with this was all forms of competition except bombs and bullets killing each other. So that's why it's called Cold War. So in my list, this counts in the no war column, because war in this case is just a metaphor. So could you imagine in the relationship between the U.S. and China taking some lessons from the Cold War and some lessons from the British adaptation and actually some lessons from the other two cases, as well as some that are taken from the mistakes, to fashion a relationship between the U.S. and China? I think you could. You could imagine that happening. So that would be, yes, we can. But the answer is, well, will we? Will we have that degree of imagination? Will we summon that? And if you were a pessimist, you would say, I'm not going to bet on it. So that's basically the three questions, three tweets, three little bit of explanation. There are, in this chapter, in the book, a dozen chapters that go off in many different directions on other topics. And I'd be happy to proceed from here on whatever subjects people would like.
Good afternoon. My name is Chris Alexander, and I direct Davidson College's Dean Rusk International Studies program, and I have the arduous task of stewarding your questions this afternoon. We have a fascinating topic, a fabulous speaker, and a room full of curious, smart people. So could I ask you to help us get through more of your questions by doing the following things? I will recognize you. If you would then please stand. We have high ceilings, so speak loudly. And could I ask you to please state your question and make it a question rather than a statement? This is a difficult day, perhaps, to do that. But to state your question as succinctly as you can so that we can maximize the number of people who have an opportunity to ask. So with that, this gentleman right here.
About the TPP? Yes. TPP is a good example, and the recent action with respect to climate is a similar, in which basically, sadly, in my view, the U.S. retreated from the field in a competitive situation and left it open for China. So I actually have not been able to find in any of my cases precedent for this, in which in the competition between the rising power and the ruling power, in domains that were advantageous to the ruling power, where it had relationships with powerful allies, it basically withdrew from the situation. So TPP, just to remind you all, was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, an effort that was made both by Republicans and Democrats in the Obama administration. Actually, more enthusiasm for it in the business world than and considerable objection to it in the labor world. It ended up failing in American politics, both on the right and on the left. So Trump trashed it, but so did Bernie Sanders, equally in terms. But what had happened was, in a trade negotiation, the parties have to try to make compromises. So they negotiate and they agree. And the U.S. had said, count on it, this is going to happen. And so most of the other countries, these Asian countries, had already made the compromises, and including paying the domestic cost at home of giving up something. So, for example, Prime Minister Abe in Japan had sacrificed the interests of a lot of farmers on whose votes he depends to get this agreement. But then when we withdrew from the agreement has collapsed. And China is now going around on a bilateral basis, making its deal with each one of the parties, and it's even going to have a weaker version of a regional. So I would say that was a case in which, sadly, we made a mistake and shot ourselves in the foot. I think the climate piece, if I just say one word on that, is a similar picture. So almost everybody who has seriously looked at the question believes that the current pattern of emitting greenhouse gases will make the environment almost impossible for people to inhabit in 100 years or so. But in any case, some human beings that you could imagine were your great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. So the question is whether we can find a way to meet our energy demands without making an environment that's inhospitable. So the Paris Accord was not great, but it was a very important step forward in recognizing the problem and starting to take actions with respect to it. And in, again, this case, I think by withdrawing from the field, we leave China as the champion of green and climate. Now, the irony in both this, so at Davos this past year, again, the U.S. having pulled out of TPP, Xi Jinping was celebrated as the leader of the liberal economic order. I mean, the irony is just wonderful. So all the other leaders of the world, oh, you're a great leader. China is the most mercantilist, protectionist economy in the world. Absolutely, without question. Way, way, way beyond the U.S. So the idea that China becomes the leader of this, Xi Jinping loves it, okay? He loves the adulation. In the climate space, China is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. China gets 70% of its energy from coal. China is the leader of the green climate coalition. Here's Xi with Mrs. Merkel the other day, basically celebrating. And Jerry Brown, the governor of California, was there yesterday, basically with Xi saying, thank goodness you're the leader of the green climate world. So I would say Thucydides would be puzzled at our actions. Absolutely. It's a great question. And again, I was trying to condense a lot of stuff at once. So is there anybody in China who thinks war with the U.S. is a good idea? No. I don't believe there's a single person. Is there anybody in the Pentagon who thinks war with China is a good idea? I can tell you 100%. No, absolutely not. So people understand war would be catastrophic and crazy. And after the war, you would say this is nuts. So it would be nice to conclude from that war therefore can't happen. And that's the problem. If you look at history, you discover that in fact there are many cases in which all those conditions obtained, and nonetheless there was a war. So the case that counts and that I think deserves careful study, and I have a whole chapter on this one case, it's the only a single case in which I take a whole chapter, is 1914. And I believe you cannot study 1914 too much. So just to remind you, 100 years ago today, what were we doing? We were having World War I. U.S. had actually just entered. We finally arrived in April, when we finally decided to enter the war, of April of 1917. War had started in 1914. So how conceivably could the assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo by a terrorist, a Serbian terrorist who belonged to a group called the Black Hand? So if you were writing a novel, you couldn't make all this up, okay? So this becomes a match that produces a fire that burns down the whole of Europe. What? Did anybody want a war? The World War I? No. Okay. So how could this possibly do? And I would say, if you study it through Thucydides' lens, you see you had a rising Germany that created a great deal of fear in Britain. Germany had reunified in 1870, was about half the size of Britain at the time in GDP. By 1900 it was equal. By 1914 it was a quarter larger. It was building a big navy. The British were accustomed to ruling everything. That was the empire in which the sun never set, ruled the waves for 100 years. So in any case, you have this Thucydidean tension between Britain and Germany. Each of them become more entangled with other parties. So the Germans have no allies except for Austro-Hungary. So they figure, I got to at least keep my one ally. The British have gotten entangled with the French, and the French have gotten entangled with the Russians. So the assassination occurs, and then one thing leads to the next. And you still, when I work it through, and I've looked at this case many, many times, it's still unbelievable. Many times people should have simply looked and said, hey, I see where this is going. We don't want to go there. Nobody wants to go there. Think of what happened. At the end of the war, what had happened to the thing that each of the actors cared about most. They lost. So the Austro-Hungarian emperor was trying to hold together his empire. Ended the war in 1918, the empire's dissolved, and he's gone. Russian Tsar is trying to back his buddies, the Serbs, who were Orthodox. What's happened to him? He'd been overthrown his whole regime by the Bolsheviks, the communists, so he's gone. The Kaiser in Germany is trying to support his buddy in Vienna, but he's gone. He, the Kaiser, out. Okay? France is supporting Russia, but France has then bled of its youth for a whole generation. It never recovers as a society. And Britain, which has been a great creditor nation, is now turned into a debtor and is on a path of terminal decline. So you look and you say, well, who wanted this war, who needed this war, who would choose this war? If you had given these people a chance for a do-over, nobody would have made the decisions that he made. But they made the decisions, and one thing led to the other. So I think history would suggest to us that even where there are very thick economic interests, which there were between Germany and Japan. I mean, actually, I discussed this in the book. What was the best-selling book in Europe in the decade before 1914? It was a book called The Grand Illusion by a fellow named Norman Angell. It's a very interesting book to read. And it says Germany and Britain's economies are so thickly intertwined that war would be an illusion because anyone who fought war would lose the war. And we can all see this. And actually, who was the richest man in the world in 1914? It was a guy named Andrew Carnegie. He had built a steel industry. He was richer relatively at the time than Gates and Buffett to get together. He had then started spending his money to give it away. That's how we got libraries, all the Carnegie libraries everywhere, including in Charlotte. But he also, his big cause was peace. So he built in The Hague, many of you have seen it, the Peace Palace. And that opened in 1913. And then in January 1914, he sent a note to each of his nearest and dearest, 4,000 friends, who included all the leaders of all the countries. And he said, I'm glad to announce that peace has arrived. This is January 1st, 1914. And we now know, because of Angell's book, that war would be self-defeating. And we have a location in the Peace Palace, and we have a court called the Permanent Court of Arbitration. So countries that have disputes can bring their disputes to the Court of Arbitration. It can resolve them, so there will be no more wars. That's 1914. So I would say there have been many illusions that said war couldn't happen. And I look at the current situation between U.S. and China. I think the thing closest to Sarajevo and the assassin's bullet is what's happening on the Korean Peninsula, where I can quite easily imagine, with just a few short steps, getting from what Kim Jong-un is currently doing to what Donald Trump says he's going to do to him if he keeps doing it, to a war between the U.S. and China. What threats within China? It's a good question, very good question. So I have a chapter on what Xi's China wants, where I try to dig into the current leader of China, and his leadership team, a couple of whom I happen to know. One of them, his chief economic advisor, was a student of mine at Harvard 20 years ago, a fellow named Liu He, who I talk to regularly about this. They have a list of 17 insurmountable problems, they call them, that they're coping with. So they identify the problems and they struggle with them, and one of them is, we can't breathe the air in Beijing. So half of the time, the air in Beijing is hopeless. So they're working on the problem, and I would bet you 5 years from now they'll have done something substantial about it. They got another problem. Maybe we're going to grow old before we grow rich, is one of the things they say, because they got an aging society. So how are they dealing with that? Well, the part of the aging problem is that they had a one-child policy. So they've scratched their head and they've given it up. So now people have more children. So there'll be a little bit of a demographic bump, so there's a whole range of problems that they're dealing with. I look at it, and I probably unduly, the critics of the book would say I'm too much enamored of the views of Lee Kuan Yew and Henry Kissinger, and I agree that they are big impacts on my view. But Lee Kuan Yew, looking at it, said about Xi Jinping, he said, this man has iron in his soul. And he said, I would bet on this guy. And I would say now he's the most impressive leader on the international stage that I see. today. He's hugely ambitious, way too ambitious, I would say. He's bitten off too many things, as I describe in the book, I believe. But if you look, in the period since the great financial crisis and the Great Recession, one country has managed its affairs so that China has continued growing at more than 3 times the rate of the U.S. So I have, again, a discussion of this in the book. If you do a word cloud search in the newspapers here about the Chinese economy, it says Chinese economy, the thing is slowing, or some synonym thereof. And if you do U.S. economy, what's the word cloud search? It says recovering. Okay? But the Chinese slowdown has still remained more than 3 times the U.S. recovery. Okay? So we grow at about 2% and a little bit, and they grow at about 6.5% and a little bit. So I would say, it's perfectly possible that this won't continue forever, and it won't. Obviously, trend lines can't continue forever. And they have clearly way big problems at home. As I say, Liu Hei's got his list of 17. I mentioned some of them in the book. But they also have a team that they believe is very competent. They're perfectly prepared to take hard decisions. They then go about implementing the decisions, and if those don't work, they change and make another decision. So I think they've been quite adaptable, and I would not bet against them. Okay, 2 great questions, and we should do a seminar rather than here just doing bite-sized answers. But if I mean, they're wonderful questions. I think let me start with the second one. I argue in the book that actually we had a great Cold War strategy. I was a true believer Cold War warrior. I worked very happily for Ronald Reagan against the evil empire, and I think we did them in, and I think that was a good thing. So I think they were the evil empire, and I think it was the right thing, that the conclusion. But in '91, the U.S. then went on a victory parade, or a kind of a celebratory, maybe even triumphalism, and many people declared, like Frank Fukuyama, the end of history. So now everybody's going to be democracy and a market economy, and there's going to be globalization, and all the problems that we knew about in the past are past, and Russia will pretty soon be more or less like the U.S., and that's okay. And I would say that was foolish, absolutely in the extreme. And we actually haven't had a serious strategic reassessment of our position, our grand strategy in the world, in the period since then, which is part of the reason why I think the way we've played the China hand is very unsatisfactory, but also the way we played the Russia hand. In the Russian case, the expansion of NATO east, contrary to the understandings that were given at the end of the Cold War, basically confirmed in the minds of the Russian national security establishment, not just Putin, but this is across the whole national security establishment, that NATO was still the primary enemy, and that our objective was to continue to undermine them. And actually, for Putin, to undermine his regime, as he thinks about it. And so part of what one's seeing in Russiagate is payback, or for what he sees us meddling in his politics and trying to undermine his regime. Well, let me see what I can do for you. So I think that the failure to recognize that Russia is, even though it's weak, it's a player, a significant player. It still remains a nuclear superpower. Wake up. We can't have a war with Russia, or else we could kill all of each other. So it has to produce some constraints, has meant that mostly the Russia policy has been a failure. And I also agree with Kissinger on this, and this is a very contrarian view from Washington overall, that basically the Obama administration's demonization of Putin, which is also reflected in a lot of the current or it gets reflected in the current debate about what's going on in Washington, which is a circus of its own and a separate subject, was a big mistake. Okay? A big mistake, because what we have to be interested in is the behavior of countries. However we like them, however we don't like them, it's things they do that matter to us, and we should be trying to shape those. And if we fail to shape those, we can blame them, and it's fun to blame other people because we don't want to blame us. But our task, the job, why it's hard, is dealing with bastards is hard work. That's the job of international politics. And if they behave in ways that are harmful to our interests, shame on us. That's a failure on our part. So that's And for Thucydides Trap, basically, it's not part of the analysis of the Russian story. That's been a serious decline in their relative strength. But I think the mistake that's been made is not to recognize that Russia is a big, serious player in the world. As we can see in Syria, they're one of the most important players. But in many, many domains, we've allowed them to become aligned with China, in which is now quite a thick alliance, and so they're on the Russian side of most of these exercises, whereas we should have, if we were trying to create conditions in which China would be making adaptations and compromises that fit within frameworks that were serving our interests, we would like to have Russia cooperating on our side of the ledger. But I think that the way the Russian hand has been played has meant that now the thickest relationship that China has is with Russia, and vice versa. The first trip that Xi Jinping took when he became president was to see Putin. At the event of One Belt, One Road last week in China, after Xi gives his speech, who pops up next? Putin. So these guys are quite thick.
Welcome home, and thank you for your questions.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dr. Allison, on behalf of the World Affairs Council, we present you our plaque here, and thank you so much for our excellent, excellent program.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all very, very much for coming. Just want to remind you, I know most of you are members, but if those that are not, please join. It's the best $50, $75 you'll ever spend. And those of you that are members, think about elevating your membership. It's what allows LJ and the group to bring programs like this today. Thank you very much. Meeting adjourned. Oh, yeah.